Zvuk misli.
Podcast Instituta za filozofiju i društvenu teoriju.
Hello and welcome to the final episode of the season 2 of Zvuk misli, or Sound of Thought, podcast of the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. Today we have honor to host here Éric Fassin, a professor of sociology in the political science department and the co-chair of the gender studies department at Paris 8 University. So Éric, welcome.
Thank you.
I will give just a little bit short introduction about you and your work for our audience and listeners before we continue, but jump in if something is outdated. His work, as many of the listeners probably know, focuses on contemporary sexual and racial politics, including immigration issues in France, Europe, and the United States, often from a comparative perspective. He is frequently involved in the French public debates on issues. On issues his work addresses, from gay marriage and gender parity to the politics and policies of immigration and race, as well as the evolution of the left. And I think the idea of this podcast is to try to grasp a little bit about all of these various topics. And I don't know if we can succeed in that endeavor in just under an hour, but I'll try my best, and I hope you will too. So
I will try my best.
Okay, we have a deal. So I will start a little bit with actually pigging back on our previous episode that we filmed with Stefan Jonsson, our research member from the Cure project, and that that social scientists and researchers have noticed so-called depolitization, where personal preferences undermine collective and social political actions. And for example, in Serbia, on the Cure project research, we found that politics as whole is seen as intrinsically immoral and dirty activity, on which a decent person, something that a decent person should avoid in order to keep the let's say, a moral capital as one of the only resources that is left to a citizen after the transition and everything. So having in mind all these difficulties, how are we to articulate an intersubjective call for a social change? Or are there any focal points we, researchers, or we, the left, should rely on?
Well, first, thank you for having me in this conversation. It's a pleasure, and I'll try my best to sort of contribute something useful. The first thing that I would say is that, of course, there is a rejection of politics that is not specific to one country or another. An indication is the number of people who don't vote. That's a signal that has been more and more obvious in the context of France, but also in the context of many other countries. The second indication is the rise of the far right. People voting for the far right believe in politics, but they also believe that politics is dirty at the same time. And I think the two together are crucial for understanding what is going on in politics. In many ways, what the far right has been saying is politics is dirty, therefore you should vote for us. We're not doing politics, we're just representing the people. How come more and more people either stop voting or vote for the far right? And again, this is not specific to one country. We've had the election of Bolsonaro in Brazil, we've had the election of Trump in the United States, etc. So how come? I think an argument that is not specific to my own approach, but which is central, I believe, is the fact that it has to do with neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, as we know, suggests that we're economic actors, and therefore we're not defined politically. Of course, it doesn't mean that there's no politics in neoliberalism, but it doesn't claim to be a political discourse. In practice, what it does is the opposite of what many people thought when the Berlin Wall collapsed. At that time, the idea was this was the advent of democracy. That is, on the one hand, you had the free market, on the other, you had a free political society. So democracy and the markets went hand in hand. That was 1989. What we have seen since is that there is no necessary connection between the two, and possibly there's a contradiction between the two, between democracy and the markets. And in particular, that has been the case with the logic of neoliberalism that says, with Margaret Thatcher, that there is no alternative. If there is no alternative, that means there's no politics. It just means that what you're doing is dictated by reality. It's not a choice premised on ideology, on values, on preferences, on politics. It's an absence of choice that is the consequence of the economy. So the economy tells us what we should do.
I think that, so sorry for jumping in, but that maybe brings us to probably the third indicator that in literature known as membership to management switch in political parties. They are also losing their membership and active members. It's just they are kind of organized as businesses.
Indeed.
Kind of.
What we've seen in many countries is that people who join parties are potential candidates, which means it's a career.
Yeah.
You're not fighting for values. Say the Communist Party in France and in many other countries 40 years ago, people joined because they wanted to contribute to education, popular education, because they wanted to participate in training society. Now, that's not the point. The point is to advance a career in politics. So it's a job, just like any other job. And of course, that also means that it can communicate between politics and jobs in the real economy. You can go from one to the other successively and sometimes simultaneously. If you have money, you can become a politician. If you're a politician, maybe you'll get money. So this, I think, has to do with the idea that politics is not a separate field. There's no autonomy of politics. And of course, there is no alternative means that there's no reason why people should vote. If basically you don't have a choice between two different options, or if the two different options end up being one and only option, why bother to vote?
It's going to happen anyway.
It's going to happen. And this we have seen first with the right. The right basically says, no, it's not about politics, it's about reality. But that, of course, is the traditional discourse of the right. The right doesn't claim to engage with ideology most of the time. They're just saying, you know, we're adapting to the world as it is. The change was when social democrats in many European parties, but also in the US, decided that they too wanted to be realistic. Embracing realism means embracing a vision of society that is based on the idea that reality dictates politics. Therefore, there's no politics, because there's no choice, there's no alternative. So realism was the argument that convinced, or the rhetoric that convinced social democrats that in fact they had to do something that was not so very different from the right. It was a kinder, gentler, to use the phrase of George Bush, a kinder, gentler form of conservatism. More open, slightly more egalitarian, etc., etc. But not radically different. It's not an alternative project. And then the problem since has been for the radical left, that is, people who are not willing to join this social democratic embrace of realism, because they think the job of the left is to say something different. Now, the problem has been for many people on the left who try to maintain a left-wing definition of the left, who try to avoid the trap of realism. The difficulty has been repeated defeats. That is, when you lose one battle after another, when you feel that no matter what you do, it doesn't work, then things become difficult. You're tempted to think, even if you don't say it, that you're never going to win, and therefore there is no alternative. So the very same people on the left who denounce Tina, there is no alternative, end up thinking that maybe that's true. Hence what I call activist depression.
And is that something that you also, or we discussed yesterday at the talk here, when you start enjoying your position of a loser and you're like the outlaw, and you see yourself only as a pressure group, but never even potentially as a winner?
I think there's a risk. There's a long tradition on the left that has been studied, for example, by Enzo Traverso, who talks about left-wing melancholy. And I think, of course, if the left wants to change the world, it's not surprising that the left has a harder time winning than the right, maintaining the world, preserving the world as it is probably less difficult than changing the world. So, on the whole, you cannot expect the left to prevail all the time. It's unlikely. And historically, that has not been the case. So melancholy, I think, is inevitable. However, there's a risk that in the end, there's a sort of enjoyment, a sort of jouissance in losing. It proves that I'm right. I think losing doesn't prove that I'm right. It doesn't prove that I'm wrong, but it proves that the balance of power is not likely to be all the time on my side, and actually that it might be less on my side than on other sides. So I think we have to be careful, because basically if we accept this jouissance of the loser, we're in a way vindicating what I call activist depression. It's the sort of sunny side of the activist depression. That is, we're bound to lose. We're just trying to make it feel glorious, but the result is losing. I personally have lost many battles, but I prefer to win. I much prefer to win. So the idea, when I spend time doing my work, speaking about my work, is to encourage people to feel that there are some battles that we can win. Let's try to win as many as we can. And for me, this melancholy is inevitable, but this jouissance or the activist depression, the two sides of the same coin, are, in my view, the ultimate ruse of neoliberal reason, or to paraphrase Hegel. The ultimate trick of neoliberal reason, because basically, if people get used to losing, if they stop fighting, if they're discouraged, or even worse, if they start enjoying losing, it makes it much easier for those who want to continually expand the logic of neoliberalism. So depression is a luxury that we cannot afford, and even worse, the jouissance of losing is something that is a sort of peril, I think, for the left. We should not enjoy losing. We should really try to enjoy winning.
Yeah, but this again brings me to another thing you spoke about yesterday before we continue, and that what I found really kind of puzzling or inspiring, or I didn't see it that way before. And you were speaking about that difference between resentment and indignation, and like, how does that refer to, or I kind of connected that to the difference between the right and the left, that one really draws on one of those affects and the other does or should on the other one?
Well, I have tried to make this somewhat theoretical argument about affects, because it seems to me that there could be otherwise a temptation to think that people vote based only on their economic situation, on their class situation, and on their place in the neoliberal globalized world. In practice, there has been the tendency to say, well, if people are losers in neoliberal globalized societies, they will end up voting on the far right. I think it's much more complicated. You have many winners in globalization who vote with the far right, and you have many losers who don't vote for the far right. So I think it's much more complicated, and so we cannot have this sort of economic determination. It's not sufficient. It can play a role, but it's not sufficient. And that's where you need to talk about affects. That is, the fact that people have not only emotions, but emotions that are inseparable from intelligence, that is, from how they understand the world. So in practice, I suggest distinguishing between resentment and indignation. Two different forms of anger. And I think it's useful to differentiate them. Of course, I should say immediately that I know that there can be resentment on the left. But the idea is what should be our sort of ideal affect on the left, by contrast to the affects mobilized by the right. We know, for example, that the right mobilizes fear. But I think it's also important to see that it mobilizes resentment, precisely because otherwise we can confuse all the different forms of anger. Now, what do I call resentment? Well, it's the idea that others are having a good time when I'm not.
Envy.
Envy, but in particular, the idea that they don't deserve, and I do deserve. And what's interesting is if you start being carried away by resentment, it's not just that you're going to hate the rich because they're enjoying what you don't have. You can also resent the poor. You can resent beggars. You can resent people who get welfare from the state. Why?
You have to work.
Because I have to go to work, and they're assisted by the state, etc. So gypsies are privileged. That's what people have said in many countries. Of course, this seems to me unacceptable from a left-wing perspective.
Of course.
So how can we think about anger without resentment? That's where indignation gets in. And of course, I borrow the term in part from the indignados in Spain, this mobilization of people who were outraged, who were horrified by injustice. And the difference between resentment and indignation is that resentment is always about me. Indignation is about us, which means the problem is not only, it can be, but it's not only that I don't have this and others have that, is that it's unfair. It's unfair for all of us.
And you can see it even though you are aware of your privilege, you can see that there is injustice.
That's why I can talk about it, because obviously I'm not among the poor. I'm an academic. I live in France. I have a full-time position. So if I were in the politics of resentment, I would say there's nothing I'm allowed to say. But if I'm in the politics of indignation, I can say it's unfair, even if in many ways I have privileges, including race privileges. I'm not going to get in trouble with the police. It's very unlikely. If I were black, I would know that there's a risk for me or for my children. So, in fact, the problem of police violence, from the point of view of indignation, is our problem. It's not the problem of those who suffer from this police violence. It's our collective problem. It's injustice. So I think it's very important to differentiate between the two, because otherwise the anger, including on the left, can veer towards resentment. So I think we should avoid resentment at any cost. If we want the left to be on the left, we should leave resentment to the far right.
But still embrace our anger in another modality.
Why else would I be speaking to you now? The only reason I'm here, I mean, not the only reason, but the first reason I'm here is because I'm not happy with the world as it is. And I think if you're on the left, you cannot be satisfied with the world as it is, because otherwise you wouldn't want to change it. So if you want to change the world, if you want more justice, if you want more freedom, if you want more equality, you're indignant because that's not the way it works. And why are you indignant? Because theoretically it should work like that, because we claim to be democracies. That's why indignation is a specifically democratic phenomenon. It's because there's a discrepancy between our official values and the reality that we live in. We claim that everyone is a citizen. But we know that's not the case. There are first-class citizens and second-class citizens, and actually classless citizens as well, or non-citizens. So we know that the democratic world is not democratic. This hypocrisy of our world is what makes us, when we're on the left, indignant, which is very different from the resentment of people who feel, what about me?
And speaking about resentment, in your essay, Populism, the Great Resentment, you take issue with Chantal Mouffe's political project of left-wing populism, warning of the way in which populism erases real issues or class issues, class struggle, and prevents us from thinking about new horizons and new projects on the left, or maybe some more progressive thinking. And how can we define this populist moment, which in recent years has become the crossroads of political struggles and which inspires movements both on the left and on the right, or those who claim to be on the left, against neoliberalism? And also, what puzzles me as also, besides being a researcher, also being an activist, how can we make the left more desirable and to mobilize around social justice issues, for example, or the poverty, or whatever we think of as important leftist subject in our societies, but without falling into the trap of populism?
Well, first, about the debate with Chantal Mouffe and about left-wing populism. And then I'll move on to desire and desirability. Well, as you know, Chantal Mouffe has been a very powerful advocate of left-wing populism. This has played an unusually important role because she was in close contact with people in Spain, with the movement Podemos, but also she was in close contact with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leader of the France Insoumise. And she contributed to their joining this logic of left-wing populism. There's, for example, a debate between Mélenchon, Chantal Mouffe, and her husband, who then died, and they were trying to, the philosophers were trying to convince the politician that he should convert to left-wing populism, and it worked. So whereas in 2012, Mélenchon had played the card of the left by having a parti de gauche, a left-wing party called like that, and playing on all the imagery of the left with the red flag, with the international as a song, etc. In 2017, Jean-Luc Mélenchon changed course and decided that he was not going to talk about parti de gauche, erasing the left, and talk about la France insoumise and using the tricolor flag, etc. It's meant to be pragmatic. I have doubts, because in my view, it doesn't work. And the intention, of course, was to be pragmatic. But I think not only does it not work, and we have empirical evidence for that, because people who voted for the National Front or the National Rally that is for the far right don't switch back to the left, even when the left talks about the nation. There's a phrase by Jean-Marie Le Pen, the father of Marine Le Pen, the current leader of the National Rally. He said that people prefer the original rather than the copy. And so basically imitating the far right is good for the far right and bad for the imitator, be it a right-wing or left-wing imitator. So I think we have ample empirical evidence that it doesn't work. But the idea by Chantal Mouffe was that, in fact, if you want to win, you have to hear what's going on. And you have to pay attention to the anger. But she does not differentiate between the resentment and the indignation. You have to pay attention to this anger. And so you have to understand that the people who are far-right populists, in fact, are not so different from left-wing workers who are unhappy with globalization, with neoliberal globalization. They're pretty much the same. They all have democratic values. There is a democratic core which is common, in her view, to both the right-wing populists and the left-wing populists. I believe that suggesting there's a democratic core in what I would call neo-fascism is very dangerous. That's why I insist on talking about neo-fascism and not just right-wing populism. Because if you say right-wing populism, well, then you can say left-wing populism. But if you say neo-fascism, you're less likely to say left-wing neo-fascism. So it seems to me very important not to be delusional. There's nothing democratic about the extreme right. That's why we have to call it the extreme right. Of course, today it's not like the extreme right of the 1920s and 1930s, and so, for example, Marine Le Pen does not say that she's going to overthrow the Republic. Sure enough. But we know that, for example, Trump tried to have a coup after the elections. We know that Bolsonaro in Brazil is preparing a coup, a military coup. He says it. He announces it. So they say they're in favor of democracy as long as they win. So I think it's very dangerous to erase the anti-democratic nature of the far right. That's why I have criticized left-wing populism precisely when it became a sort of official logic of the dominant party on the left in 2017 as a warning. It won't work and it's dangerous. Why is it dangerous? Not only because it doesn't recognize the anti-democratic values of the far right, but also because in many ways it erases or contributes to the erasure of the difference between right and left.
It kind of makes it more acceptable.
Exactly. And who keeps repeating neither right nor left? The far right. So it is essential when you're on the left to insist on the fact that left and right are different. Because only the left cares about this. Only the left insists on the fact that there must be a difference between right and left.
Because the right benefits of the perception that there is no difference.
The right says, you know, there's no alternative. And the far right, they say neither right nor left. So who should say something different? The left. So if you're on the left and you say, oh, forget about the left, who's left to talk about the left? So my claim is that, very simply, when you say left-wing populism, that means that populism is the noun. And you qualify it with left-wing. which you can change by saying right wing. Left is not a qualifier. It's the substance of what we want to create, of what we try to reinvent. Of course, there's a crisis on the left. No one knows what it means. Oh, we're not sure it has any content, etc. But it's our job to produce meaning, to invest the word left with meaning, not to accept the fact that is encouraged by the media, that is encouraged by politicians, that, oh, it's a thing of the past. We have evidence that it's not a thing of the past because, in fact, the far right wants to erase it. Yesterday, in France, you had Marine Le Pen saying, we don't want to sit on the far right in the National Assembly. Why? Because they know it's meaningful. They refuse the term. They've tried to sue people in court to avoid using that term. That's why I strongly disagreed with Chantal Mouffe, as I wrote, because she didn't want to use the term far right for the far right. She minimized this far right logic. I think we cannot afford to do that. So many people are doing it. That's what the right is doing. Today in France, that's what Macron is doing. That's what the traditional right wing is doing. They just elected 2 vice presidents from the National Rally for the National Assembly. So they're not, I mean, they're doing the same thing. They're saying, oh, well, they're a legitimate political party. Is that what we want to say? Do we want to contribute to the legitimacy of the far right? Of course, this is what's happening. But do we want to go with the flow, or do we want to build an alternative discourse? I think our job is precisely that. Progressively rebuild an alternative discourse to say, this is what the left could mean for today. We're not sure exactly what it's going to be like, but at least we have to decide that's what we want to do. Now, the second part of the question was about desire. I'll try to be less long-winded in my response, even though, of course, it's important. We've seen this rejection of politics, this disgust with politics, which is more important among people who could vote for the left. For example, young people. Young people vote far less than old people. So you have conservative old people deciding for young people on who's going to be running the country and what their lives are going to be like. So there is disgust, there is distrust. But as we've seen, far-right voters do vote. They're not disgusted.
And they're very well organized.
They're well organized, they're mobilized. They believe that the winds of history are running in their direction. So the question is, what's happening with all those who don't vote or who are totally discouraged, and etc.? And of course, for me, that's the response to Chantal Mouffe, because Chantal Mouffe is saying, let's win over far-right voters, and I'm saying, let's win over people who don't vote. Because people who don't vote have a major advantage from my point of view, is that they chose not to vote for fascists. That's a pretty good quality by my standards.
It's something to start with.
So it's not sufficient, but it's a good start. In a democracy, people who are not tempted by fascism, they're my friends. People who are tempted by fascism, well, we'll see later. But let's not start with them. Once we win, we'll see what happens. Now, if we try to understand what's going on, what we see is people find politics on the left not desirable. So the goal is to make our politics desirable. We know that people on the far right are having a great time. They're pretty happy. That's why I don't want to present them as losers. They're winners. They're very happy. They're having the best time of their lives. They're out of the closet. They're in the open claiming that they're right and they're winning and they're enjoying beating
Very
up.
confident. And
Yeah, they can beat up people, insult them, etc., and they have the police supporting them, etc. That's great. They feel great, and we feel miserable. So how can we avoid feeling miserable? Well, we have to do things that we find desirable. And so we have to make our politics desirable to others, but to ourselves to start with. Because basically, if we're just sad, if we're just depressed, if our only jouissance is in losing, we're not going to have many allies. In particular, young people prefer to have an exciting life. I mean, basically, the jouissance of losing, when you're 50 or 60, okay, but when you're 20 or 30, you think, hey, is that all there is to life? So I think we have to make this desirable. Politics should be desirable. How do we do that? Of course, that's complicated, but we should look at what already exists. For me, a very interesting example is what's happened with feminism. Feminism used to be old-fashioned. Many people in my generation believed that feminism belonged to the past, that feminists were anything but sexy, that basically feminism was against sex. I think that has changed considerably, not just because feminists can have a positive discourse about sexuality, because in fact there has been a lot of discussion among feminists about sexual violence. So it's not just saying, oh, orgasm is great. It's not just that. It can be that as well. But it's also the idea that fighting is great.
That it's empowering.
That actually demonstrating, denouncing, choreographing, and I take the example of Las Tesis in Chile, the fact that this choreography became an international model for many women, for many feminists throughout the world, meant that what they did was desirable. It was desirable because, in a way, they dared to show themselves and to be very assertive and not to worry about the fact that people thinking this is not exactly a feminine way of behaving or whatever. They are powerful.
And also, I think what's also important from my perspective for a feminist movement, you're not a victim and you're not alone, but you're part of a group. There
Exactly.
is a sense of belonging and togetherness and solidarity, and that's likable.
And you can see quite physically how they're encouraged, empowered by the fact that they're a collective. That is, I imagine that if one of them had to do that, it might be a bit silly or look a bit silly. But here, it feels powerful. That's one example. But I think more generally what's been happening with Me Too has been about empowerment. And as you say, Me Too, in fact, is not Me Too, is us too. It's a collective. But each individual can feel part of a greater whole. So in a way, it's sort of picks up where the 1970s left with consciousness raising. Except that today, of course, we have the social networks and hashtags, etc. And I have found that the politics of the hashtag, or what I call this, have been quite important in the recent period. Many people have said, no, you know, hashtags, that's not real political work. Well, Me Too? Black Lives Matter? If we think of Black Lives Matter, what has it meant? That basically people are saying our lives normally don't matter, and we are claiming that they do matter. And of course it's we, meaning blacks, but it's not just blacks, because you've had many whites siding with Black Lives Matter. So these two examples of the politics of the hashtag, for me, are interesting in that they show what is desirable. Seeing empowerment that is not being trapped in the position of a victim is something that is essential. That's one thing I have learned by studying, because I have not experienced it, sexual harassment. Sexual harassment tells usually women, It's a man usually telling a woman, usually, you're just a woman. And rape is a variation on this. It's saying, I'm defining you. You can claim that you're a lawyer or a professor or whatever, a colleague. I'm telling you, I'm not looking at a colleague. I'm not looking at a professor. I'm not looking at a lawyer. I'm looking at a body. You're just a woman. How can women respond to that? It's complicated, obviously, and I'm not saying that I'm telling women how to proceed, but what feminists have said, and successfully, is if you start speaking up, you're not the object any longer. You're the subject. And the object becomes what happened. So it reverses.
You're taking your agency back.
Exactly.
You're appropriating it.
And I think this can be an example for all the issues that we're talking about. Who defines whom? The right has been very good at defining others. I think the left has to define itself. This is what feminists have been doing. This is what racial minorities have been doing more and more. And I think instead of opposing traditional class issues to minority issues, which has been a temptation on the left in many countries, including France, in the name of Marxism, but in fact, I think with a very uninteresting view of Marxism, and very often a very conservative view of Marxism, which happens to coincide with the view of many people on the right. Instead of opposing minority issues to class issues, I think we have to insist on the lessons that can be learned from minority movements. Because in fact, the politics of coalition can work precisely because we learn from different social movements. So it's not either or, it's both class and minority issues. And in part because minorities have had to invent a language that is not to be defined by others. Minorities are used to be defined by others. That's what being a minority is about. And of course, when I say minorities, I include women, even though they're a statistical majority. They're not a majority in terms of power. They're a minority. They're minoritized. So I think what is desirable is to have subjects. And one issue for feminism has been precisely to resist this sexist vision according to which feminism is undesirable. I think this is what is changing. Many people, men and women, straight or gay or queer, many people more and more feel that, in fact, challenging the sexual order is desirable. That is, it's desirable for oneself, but it's what we find desirable in others. That is, desiring someone because he or she or they are feminists, because they are queer, etc. That is, not in spite of, but because of that. That is, desire is also political. And that is, I think, the lesson that can be learned for the left. That is, on the one hand, we have to make politics desirable. But the reverse is equally true. Desire is political. So the two have to be thought about together. And that's why minorities, and in particular feminist and LGBT plus minorities, have something to say important for the left, because they have had to think a great deal about desire. So that's where the left should learn a few lessons.
So now we're made actually a perfect introduction for our next, the cluster of questions. You have recently organized 3 international symposiums, gender trafficking, an epidemic of transphobia, and what trans knowledge does to gender studies. And you just said that the desire is political, but then What do you think stands behind the politicization of sexuality and the policing of sexuality? Sexualities.
First, I must say that I've co-organized. But it's important because, in particular, for the issues on transphobia and trans issues, the main person on the French side is a trans feminist activist and scholar, and I have participated, but I don't want to appropriate.
Take credit, of course.
I have very much encouraged and I have played a role. And second, also, only the Traffic and Gender conference has already taken place. The other two are going to be in September and October.
Okay.
And actually, anyone who wants to attend, well, the first one in September, on September 22nd, is going to be online, but it's going to be physically in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And I'll explain why. And the second one is going to be mid-October in Paris, and so everyone's welcome, including online. And the events will be in different languages, which is part of what we're trying to do, is to internationalize all this. With the difficulty that we don't have huge budgets, and so we don't have simultaneous translation. We don't even decide to go for a sort of translation afterwards or anything. We just decide that we'll adapt and we'll do what we can so that people can communicate, and with PowerPoints and all that. That is, we're trying to create conditions where international communication is not obvious. That's what we did for the Traffic and Gender. It was in French, English, and Spanish. Not everyone spoke all three languages. Most people did not. So how does it work? Well, it works because you have people in the room who are helping others, and because you have a few words written on a PowerPoint up there and all that. And so basically it means that international communication is not transparent. We cannot only rely on a sort of universal language that is English. I don't understand Serbian. That's a problem because I don't understand everything that's going on. Of course we have a common language, as we're speaking now in English, but it's important at the same time to remember that there are things that I will not understand because I don't know enough, and in particular because I don't know the language. So I think we shouldn't erase that. We shouldn't pretend that it's all globalized. It is globalized, but with linguistic differences that are also cultural differences that are contextual differences. And the only way to recognize that is by confronting the difficulty. So I have developed an argument that is based on Pentecost. That is the idea that you go out and people are supposed to understand what you're saying, but in fact they say, I don't understand why I do understand. And that's what our international communication is about. We're communicating, we want to understand. I try to understand what's going on here. I try not to misinterpret, not to interpret only in my own terms. And I think you're doing the same thing when I'm talking. You're trying to understand, what is he talking about? How much is this a French situation? How much is it true for us, etc. So we're always doing this work of traffic in interpretation, which is also traffic in gender. Now, these conferences, I mean, for me, academic work is always political work. That is, in particular, I'm finishing a book with a colleague, which is a critique of the illusion and the ideology of neutrality, which is attributed to Max Weber mistakenly, or with a radical misunderstanding of what he's saying. So I think academic work, in particular when we do sociology or social sciences, we're representing society. Representing society is political work. Indeed, everyone's trying to represent society. Politicians are doing that, but writers are doing that, activists are doing that, etc. So we're all about representing society because it's the essential political game. So it's not neutral. So there's a conference that we're organizing in October with Karine Espinera, who's a trans feminist, activist and scholar. in our research center, and a Spanish colleague, also a legal scholar, who's in our research center, Laboratoire d'études de genre et de sexualité. And her name is Beatriz Colantes. And we're organizing this conference so that basically we can show that it's not just about trans studies, it's also more broadly about trans knowledge. What's the difference? Is that trans studies is academic. Trans knowledge is not only academic. One reason why you have trans studies is because you have trans persons, some of them in academia and some of them outside of academia, who are producing knowledge. So in fact, we're trying to show that politics is within our own knowledge. Even more so because we're a gender studies program, and so what we realize is that trans studies is raising questions about gender studies. That is, has there been an implicit or sometimes explicit transphobia in gender studies? That is, even though gender studies is supposed to undermine these sexual identifications, these sexual power games. In fact, we have collectively contributed as well to gender roles. So we have to question this, and we have to learn from the critique that comes from the field. Now, the third example that you took, the one of the one-day event that is going to be organized on September 22nd in Rio de Janeiro, is called the Epidemic of Transphobia. And I'm co-organizing this, and I've involved my two colleagues, Karine Espinera and Beatriz Colantes, but also in Brazil, colleagues with whom we work on the attacks on gender, but also trans activists in Brazil. Why? Because, in fact, there's a conference opening on the same day in Brazil on September 22nd, a conference which is supposed to be about transsexuality. But in fact, which is a transphobic event organized by psychologists and doctors, medical doctors. And they've invited people from different countries, including from France. There's the psychoanalyst and historian of psychoanalysis, Elisabeth Roudinesco, who last year on television, on French television, spoke about an epidemic of transgender. This, I think, is pretty serious. That is, considering that you can pathologize what is a social movement, is very dangerous. There's a long history of this. And in fact, she's invited to this conference in Brazil, and the opening talk is supposed to be the epidemic of transgender. There are other transphobic arguments that are supposed to happen. So we decided that, after all, we could have a counter conference called the Epidemic of Transphobia. And in that case, I have no qualms, no hesitation about using the word epidemic. That is, indeed, there's an international circulation. How come they're inviting all these people from all over the world in Rio? Well, it has to do with politics. This is September 22nd, as I have said several times. Why? Because it's 10 days before the presidential election in Brazil. And as we know, Bolsonaro has used anti-gender and transphobic arguments in order to mobilize on his side against the left. So this may seem like a minor issue, but it's not. The internationalization of transphobic discourse is something that we have to take seriously. Of course, most of us may think, I'm not personally concerned by this issue. I may be cisgender and therefore not interested in transgender issues. That's a mistake. That's a big mistake, because it's not just about transgender persons. It's about politics. It's about what I call sexual democracy. In fact, we shouldn't think that issues, say, gay politics is not just about gays, or not just about gays and lesbians. Feminism is not just about women. It's about the sexual order. It's about the world that we all live in. So, in fact, minority issues are not just for minorities. Minority issues are a perspective on the world, because, in fact, minorities are defined by the norm that says some people are normal, us, and others are, oh, well, today we're civilized, so we don't say abnormal. We just say they're minorities. And so they're defined by the fact that they're not the norm. So when you raise minority issues, you're not just talking about minorities, you're talking about the majority. That is, this is why, even though I don't experience discrimination because I don't belong to a minority, I'm still personally involved in minority issues because I benefit from a relative privilege by belonging to the majority on all these issues. So I think people who might think, oh, well, who cares about trans issues, are deeply mistaken. We should all care about trans issues. We should all care about intersex issues. Of course, we're not talking about big numbers, despite the fears of an epidemic. We're not talking about huge numbers, but we're talking about the norms that define the world that we live in. The norms that privilege some people and disqualify others. The norms that exclude people. The norms that make life so difficult to live for many people, the minorities, but of course that has consequences for all of us. That is, being defined by this privilege, be it a sexual privilege or racial privilege, changes me. For example, I'm not just a person. I end up being a man with the privileges it entails. So it forces me to become a man. I'm not just a person, I'm white. And I can say, I don't care that I'm white. What matters is that I'm a human being, but I know that people who are not white don't have the luxury of saying what I'm saying. And therefore, I cannot ignore the fact that the structural racism of our society makes me white.
And finally, at least in this group of questions, what do you think that is the role of the education system as we know it, as a very still conservative social institution in the domain of sexual democracy? Or how should we change and transform our educational systems in order to benefit the sexual democracy?
Well, that's not an easy question, but I'll pretend that I know what I'm saying and I'll try to answer since I'm here. The first thing that I should say is that conservatives accuse educators of imposing a worldview. And of telling, for example, we've had the Pope who says that in schools people are taught that they should become trans or whatever, or queer, I forget. And this is just one example, but this is all over the place, hence the attacks on education in many countries, and hence the campaigns against the so-called ideology of gender. In France, people talk about the theory of gender, etc. I don't think that, of course, we should tell people how to lead their lives first. So as educators, I mean, I don't see how I could tell my students, you should do this or that. For example, I have no right to suggest that a woman should start a lawsuit if she's harassed. How could I? I'm not the one who's living her life. I shouldn't tell a gay person, come out of the closet, or etc. So I'm not going to tell people how they should lead their lives. But there are two things that I think we can do. One is, in societies that have recognized that discrimination is illegal, discrimination based on race, based on gender, based on sexual orientation, etc. It is perfectly legitimate as an educator to explain what discrimination is and to explain that it's illegal. So it's not just a moral disapproval, it's a legal constraint. Discrimination is illegal. So this is not enforcing a gay agenda or a feminist agenda or whatever. It's, as an employee of the state, which I am, and I know, of course, that's not the case for educators everywhere. For example, in the US, very often they're private employees, but with a public service mission, I think we have a duty to tell people that discrimination is illegal. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as academics at least, and I cannot claim that I know exactly what I would do if I were in a high school, because it's a bit different, because we're talking to minors, and I'm talking to people who are adults. So as an educator speaking to adults, I think my main job is critical thinking. That is, to teach critical thinking. What does critical thinking mean? It may sound abstract, but in some ways, I think it's not. It's just not accepting the world as it is, as a fact, but raising questions about the world. So not taking things for granted, not thinking that everything is obvious, but asking questions and thinking about things as they are, not to validate them, not to invalidate them, but to discuss them. That's what critical work does, raise questions. And of course, people can decide to give very different answers. For example, some people will say, you know, we should get rid of this category of sex. Men, women, it should just disappear. Others will say, no, it's very important because, in fact, since women are discriminated against, they have the necessary resource of saying, as a woman, I'm discriminated. For example, my job is not to tell people this is better or not. And if people want to be reactionary, if people want to say, I prefer to live in a society where men are superior to women, I prefer to live in a society where gays are not allowed to marry. I have nothing to say about that. I can just say what is legal, what is illegal, and I can raise questions about the underlying logic of their position, of my position, of other people's positions, etc. And I think that's the most powerful tool that we have, critical thinking. Because in fact, what we want is citizens who think by themselves. The risk is that people don't have time to think and they rely on others to think for them. The language is already available. For example, in France, we've had for 30 years explanations that anyone who criticizes the ostensibly universalist model of the Republic is favoring separatism or identity politics. This is not true because, in fact, you could make a Republican argument against discriminations. You can say, and I have often said, that universalism requires liberty and equality, that is, in particular, equal treatment. So talking about discriminations is not the same thing as talking about communities. The point is to recognize the reality of discriminations, not to recognize separate entities called communities. So the rhetoric available in public discourse has made it very difficult to hear what I'm saying. The tendency is for people who have limited time available after work to think about things, etc., is to use the existing vocabulary that is available when you turn on your radio, when you turn on your television or your computer, etc. So I think we have to take that seriously. Our job is not easy in those circumstances, but it's all the more necessary. And sometimes we may have doubts about it, precisely because we can feel powerless in this sort of huge ocean of discourse that sort of replicates dominant ideologies. Saying a few critical words that raise questions about, does it have to be like this? Can we change the world? Should we accept the reality as it is or not? So we may feel isolated, we may feel useless, we may feel powerless, but I argue that the hatred we encounter, the threats and the insults on social networks, including death threats, the attacks by governments, including in France, including by the president himself, all these attacks say something. They say that they're afraid that we're being heard, that even though we're tiny voices, still we might be heard. Why? Not because we're great, although I would like to think so, but more importantly, because people know that there's something wrong. And so they're looking for words, they're looking for arguments, they're looking for information, they're looking for ideas that will help them develop a discourse of protest against dominant discourses. A very clear example was when the president, Emmanuel Macron, first attacked academics. He had a few lines in the newspaper Le Monde, where that was in June 2020, right after the first lockdown. And he accused academics of perverting youths because academics encourage people to think about the racial question. I co-edited a volume in 2006 on this question. And he attacked all these academics whom he accused of breaking the republic into two. Now, why? Why should the president of the republic worry about academics who don't hold that many positions? It's a very small minority of people in academia who talk about these issues. They're usually not in the central institutions, etc. So why should the president care so much? Just like, why should all these people worry so much about gender ideology or gender theory, even though gender programs are marginal in our institutions? We feel weak. Apparently, they think we're very strong. Why was the president saying that? Well, for a very simple reason. Because in June 2020, there were two big demonstrations, one a few days before he spoke, one a few days after, and it was in preparation. Huge demonstrations against police violence and against racial profiling. That is, against the fact that people who had experienced police violence because they're black, because they're Arabs, all these people started finding a language available to think about their experiences as racialization, that is, being sort of trapped in a position defined by their appearance, by the color of their skin, or by their origin, by their name, etc. So the president thought that there's a connection between social movements and academic fields. The same thing had happened before for attacks on gender. Why worry about a few academics doing gender? Well, because there are evolutions such as gay marriage, because you have feminism, because you have, that is, there is some kind of a connection between social movements and academic work. It's a complex link because, in fact, academic work is in part influenced by social movements, and social movements sometimes borrow from academic knowledge. One example with which I could end is that of las tesis that I mentioned before. Their reference is to feminist scholar, Rita Segato, and the very name Las Tesis says the thesis. That is, it's a very academic name for what is an activist movement. I think this is one reason why we're being attacked, a major reason, and that's one reason, a major reason, why we should have some confidence in the importance of what we do, even though most of the time we feel powerless, useless, and in fact discouraged. So I think this is an encouragement. People who hate us are in some ways telling us that what we do matters. It's a form, a paradoxical form of recognition.
Yeah, in a way validating all our efforts, but we're witnessing those kind of attacks happening basically everywhere across Europe and not only Europe. Our institute was on the target of such attacks 2 years ago. And then what is left to us besides is some kind of, let's say, international academic solidarity the only thing that we can offer each other, or there is something else?
That's a good start. That is, in the same way, if I can make that comparison, in the same way that one woman reacting against sexual violence is isolated and therefore weak, when it's a collective of women, they're empowered, as we discussed before. I think it's the same for academics. I've worked in solidarity with colleagues in Brazil, in Turkey, in other countries, and I'm very pleased that I could co-sign the support for this institute here. I think what I have learned from these repeated experiences is that international solidarity matters. It matters in two ways. Sometimes it works. That is, sometimes we win. But even when we don't win, people know that what's happening to them matters, that it's not just about them, that we're all part of the same story. So it may not be sufficient to win, but it's very different if you lose and you know that it's a political battle and that it's recognized as such, even by people who are far away, who may not know you very well, but who understand what's going on. Because making sense of what is going on is a major political issue. I think the difficulty for many of us, for most of us, is that the world apparently doesn't make any sense. So contributing to producing meaning, I think, is our first job. So solidarity is not just warm feelings, although hopefully it is that as well, but it's also intellectual work. We're producing meaning. And I think we have, and I very much want to insist on that, we have to claim the value of intellectual work, not out of elitism, but in a context of anti-intellectualism. Anti-intellectualism is very much on the rise in most of our societies as a political discourse. It doesn't mean that people are not smart. It just means that they're anti-intellectual. So we have to defend intellectual work, first negatively against anti-intellectualism, but also positively as a political project. If you think of people like Trump, if you think of people like Bolsonaro and many others, they're saying stupid things, absurd ideas, vulgar words, etc. What are they doing? They're telling people, you know, you're stupid, I'm stupid, and we're okay. It's great to be stupid. We can be mean, we can be vulgar, we can be as absurd, foolish, clownish as we want.
And so they're in power.
And they encourage people to be like that. I think the counterattack is to tell people it's more desirable to think. It's more desirable to understand the world. It's more desirable to produce meaning. It's more desirable to be smart collectively than to be stupid. So we're presenting the choice between stupidity and intelligence as a political choice, not as a sort of individual feature. There are some people who are stupid, some people who are intelligent. Who cares about that? No. What do we want to be? Do we want to be smarter or more stupid? And I think neo-fascists are telling people it's great to be stupid. Neoliberalism is okay with that.
It profits from that.
Critical thought, on the contrary, says, we have nothing else to offer. Basically, we think it's great fun to understand the world better. And it's fun because it has consequences. So these are two political projects. And so anti-intellectualism or anti-intellectualism, which is critical thought. I think we should be proud of that political program because it's not elitist. On the contrary, it's a democratic project. If everyone is smart, then neo-fascists lose. If only a few people in academia can claim that they're smart, of course we lose. So we have no interest, no democratic interest in being elitist. The right is okay with elitist academics. We cannot afford to be elitists. We don't have the luxury of not being understood. I'm trying to speak as clearly as I can whenever I get a chance, because I think if people, after they've heard what I've said, say, oh, I feel smarter than I was 5 minutes ago, I've done my job, because I'm paid to do that. And I think it's my job, but it's also a political program. Let's try to be intelligent together instead of being stupid together.
Thank you, Eric, for this very inspiring and empowering conversation.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed it, and I think it's a perfect conclusion of our second season. So thank you again.
Thank you very much, and good luck for the Institute and its continuation and its effort at not being stupid.
Yeah, and staying angry, but in a good way.
Exactly. Indignation and, if possible, intelligence. That's a good program,
and
right?
solidarity, so yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.